Well, decolonization as a subject, I mean, it's both on the one hand very simple to explain. There were colonies, then there weren't. On the other hand, it's also immensely complicated when you get into the diplomacy of it, the politics of it, and of course not least the kind of physical presence of it. Because after all, even after the European powers left, many of the countries they previously had occupied or administered still used their currencies, still spoke their language, still to some extent mimicked aspects of the national culture. English, after all, is the language we're speaking in this classroom. I called, somewhat facetiously last term, I called the British-French War of the 18th century a battle to determine if the world would speak French or English. And that was only somewhat facetious. You could also look at the two world wars as essentially a battle to see if the world would speak English or German. Bismarck, in one of his many bon mots, and there are very, very many of them, said that one of the key geopolitical facts of the coming century, by which he meant the 20th, was that the United States of America spoke English. Now, that's to say, it could have gone another way. It could have been German. There were many colonists, after all, who were of Germanic origin. However, the dominant culture, although this is something that Americans are a little squeamish about talking about, it remains true that the dominant culture all along was the Anglo-Saxon one, the English-speaking one. Of course, Americans are losing confidence in this themselves. That's why these days you have government forms filled out in 15 different languages, why you can get a taxi in New York City and chances are the cab driver may not even speak English. But that said, the longer-term trend is clear. The world now basically speaks English. Not just because of the Americans, but even more so because of the British and their own imperial footprint. It also, of course, plays football. Soccer, as the Americans like to call it, despite the English. But this is, after all, an English game. So you could say, then, that the imprint, the legacy of imperialism, continued on after decolonization. Now, that said, the story is still important. It's important not least because it represents a kind of turning point in global affairs, the beginning of the decline of Western European power and dominance, even though, of course, to some extent, you could say it was arguably replaced by American influence and dominance, a new variety of imperialism. But certainly the old days of imperialism, the planting of the flag, implanting of the national culture, I mean, the French, when they did it, sometimes brutally, I mean, they really did it. You know, they imposed the language, their culture, they brought their furniture along with them, they brought their food, because they had such confidence in themselves. This is the way you eat, this is the way you behave, this is the way you dress. And to some extent, people around the world agreed with them. Not everyone, of course, but a lot of people were acculturated. The British were a little bit more subtle about it. They didn't quite force people to become French in the way the French did. In fact, the British were always a little bit half-hearted about it. They liked to live in their own little enclaves. You know, like the scenes where Lawrence of Arabia, if you've watched the movie, you know, he comes back, comes to the officers' club and pretends like he's English, even though he's really, by that point, kind of an Arabophile. You know, jolly, a good game of squash. You know, they all play their own traditions, but they didn't really spread them that aggressively. You know, they liked their own culture in Cairo. They didn't necessarily impose it entirely on the natives. The language did seep out, yes. But that said, at the end of the Second World War, it was clear to some that the days of empire were possibly beginning to wind down. Now, it would be, I think it would be misleading to say, however, that they had to wind down as quickly as they did. Churchill, if you remember, as an adamant imperialist, was a little bit wary of FDR. FDR, the American president, seemingly all-powerful in 1945, did not view British imperialism favorably. Oddly enough, he seemed to view Stalin even more favorably than he viewed Churchill and the British. Remember that America had been born, at least as Americans like to see it, in a kind of anti-imperialist revolt, of course, against who else? Against the British. So the Americans like to think of themselves as the sort of the anti-imperialists, the ones on the side of the underdog. They, in fact, not so subtly suggested that Britain and France should begin to wind down their empires. Now, something got in the way, and that's something, I'm not going to talk about it that much today, but the whole subject of course, Vietnam, or Indochina, as the French call it, America's own imperial tragedy, you might call it. This represented how the interests of the Cold War, in the end, overran or overturned America's own, you might say, purer instincts. Vietnam was, of course, well, basically part of a French colony, Indochina, that the Americans initially helped prop up by sending money and arms, and then they eventually took over the commitment themselves. You could say that Vietnam represented the most controversial and, to some extent, explosive and damaging example of this trend, which was America taking up the commitments of the European imperialist powers almost in spite of itself. But Vietnam was in other ways anomalous. America did not really want to fight to preserve the British or the French empires. Much the opposite. Nor, to some extent, did the British want to fight to maintain their own empire. Now, the British shift, I represented it up here basically by the famous ouster of Churchill from office in the elections of summer 1945. Literally while the Potsdam Conference was actually still in session. Churchill was voted out of office. Stalin, of course, was shocked by this because the idea of, well, Stalin being voted out of office was, of course, a sick joke. I mean, they didn't hold elections in the Soviet Union. The idea that a leader with world-famous prestige and authority would actually be kicked out of office by his own people in the very flush of glory was simply shocking. And not just to Stalin, a lot of people were shocked. But that said, there was some logic to it. Basically what it represented was the rise, of course, of the Labour Party. The Labour Party, which had been brought into the wartime coalition, the figure of Clement Attlee. There's an interesting story, actually, about Churchill and Attlee, which I think captures the essence of the two men. It's a little bit vulgar, so if you're easily offended, you might want to hold your ears. But it goes something like this. Churchill is in the urinal. He's relieving himself. Okay, so here he is. He's up against the wall. Clement Attlee comes in from the side of the room, waddles up next to Churchill, and Churchill, somewhat taken aback, decides to move down several urinals. Clement Attlee asks him, "What? Are we shy, Winston?" And Winston says, "Well, no, it's just that whenever you see something large and in good working order, you want to nationalize it." So this, anyway, represents something of the two men. Yes, it's a caricature. It's meant to almost mock and belittle labor and their whole idea of nationalizing property. But it also says something about Churchill and his supine confidence. Here was a man who believed in the British Empire, who believed in its goodness and its justice. If you actually read The River War, one of the classics of 19th century literature, Churchill goes on, he doesn't just defend it as in Britain's interest. You know, he said it was good for the natives too. He goes on and talks about how, well, you have all these warring tribes with their primitive customs. And we're coming in and we're keeping them from killing each other. We're sending them to school. We're teaching them modern medicine. He believed in all of this. He believed in Britain and its mission in the world. Attlee and the Labourites did not. Now, that said, they had a few things to recommend their own policies. Britain was, of course, increasingly broke. You remember we talked about this in the Cold War lecture last week. Britain had this position where not only did it owe all this money to the Americans, it had a dollar shortage, there was still rationing. I mean, the rationing to some extent represented Labour government before Labour was in power. In fact, I think it was Michael Foot, a former Labour Party secretary, who was once asked, you know, what would the working class utopia look like, you know, if it were ever actually created? And he said, 1940. You know, by which he meant, of course, the nation under arms, solidarity against the Germans, rationing, shared common sacrifice from, you know, the top leadership on down. Britain during the war had to some extent socialized. Now, under Labour, of course, they went even further and they began socializing heavy industry and coal, you know, things like transport eventually, you know, even like the airplanes. They nationalized most of the kind of heavy industrial sectors of the economy. Now, in foreign policy, it's not that they wanted to ditch the empire immediately, but they were much less committed to it than were the traditional Tories like Churchill. They didn't really believe in it in their heart of hearts. Yes, to some extent they had a sentimental attachment to it, but it wasn't anything like a serious commitment. It was also something, again, they simply couldn't afford. I mean, this is why they told the Americans, remember 1947, we can't keep, you know, propping up Greece and Turkey against Soviet encroachment. We can't pay for Palestine, the famous Palestinian Mandate. We'll get to that in a moment. It's a huge subject, of course. And of course, even more than that, they could no longer afford to administer India. So, when they decided to go, that is to just kind of relax these commitments, they began doing it all at once. Not all at once. I mean, they didn't give up all of their colonies immediately. But the big important ones, they did. Palestine, they basically kicked over to the United Nations and the Americans in 1947. India, they just basically decided to kick over to the Indians, which is to say, all of them, which is to say not only the Sikhs and the Hindus, but of course the Muslims as well. There were other groups as well, but those were the important ones. Now, it had not escaped anyone's attention that both Palestine and India were, shall we say, not exactly free of ethnic tension or religious tension, as the case might be. We had, of course, Arabs and Jews with disputes over the Palestinian mandate, its territory, legitimacy, etc. And in India, we had a simple matter of population movements, which was almost impossible. The idea was some kind of a partition where you'd have a state for the Muslims, and then some kind of state with a Hindu majority. The problem, of course, was that the Hindus and the Muslims lived all mixed together. Places like Kashmir and the Punjab, also places like Bengal, which was kind of the heart of what would later become East Pakistan, later turned into Bangladesh, the population was mixed. Now, if you were a Muslim living in what would become the future Hindu-dominated India, and you heard that the British were going to partition it, you might decide you wanted to leave, and of course vice versa. If you were in what would later become Pakistan, or the primary Pakistan, West Pakistan, and you were a Hindu, you might decide to leave. Now, had the British carried this out over a long period, had they said, look, we have a responsibility here, we've been here for centuries, we want to ensure an orderly transition, we want to make sure there is no rioting and no violence, then maybe, possibly, they could have kept things from getting out of hand. They didn't do that, though. Under orders from the Labour government back in England, again wanting to wash its hands of the problem. It's too expensive, we can't deal with this anymore, we're broke at home. I mean, after all, they're rationing things like cigarettes and gasoline back in Britain. It's rather hard for a government to tell the people, particularly a Labour government, that we need to step up our commitment to India, to spend more money, to send more troops. Out of the question. So what do? They literally set a timetable between February of 47 and basically July of 1948. So, you can count it out, it's about 15, 16 months. 15, 16 months. Not long enough for a kind of peaceful, orderly transition, but plenty long enough for, shall we say, agitators on both sides to get organized. To whip up the rent-a-mobs of angry Hindus, angry Muslims. One of them actually, incidentally, an angry Hindu, even murdered Gandhi in the course of the violence in 1948. And then they kicked this into the hands of poor Lord Mountbatten. He was kind of immortalized in a poem by W.H. Auden. And it actually does capture something of the sort of the mad poetic essence of the thing, just how mad it really was. Unbiased at least he was, began Auden, when he arrived on his mission. Having never set eyes on this land, he was called to partition between two peoples fanatically at odds, with their different diets and incompatible gods. Time, they had briefed him in London, is short. It's too late for mutual recognition or rational debate. The only solution now lies in separation. And so separate they did. And you had, of course, a mass spasm of interethnic, interreligious violence. At one point in the Punjab, apparently, there was a refugee trail of Sikhs and Hindus. It stretched for 57 miles. Kilometers, that would be about 95 kilometers, which would be, what, the distance, like past Polatla. Not quite all the way to Sivri Hisar. Massive refugee train. Now, no one knows how many people died. It's not like people were keeping close records. I've heard figures as high as 2 million. That's probably way too high. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500,000 people probably died in the course of this horrendous kind of rush to partition. Not exactly the finest moment, shall we say, in British imperial history. But that's the problem. I mean, here's the thing. You should always, and this doesn't just go for imperial affairs and diplomacy, this is good advice for life generally. You should always be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. The people of India had, many of them, of course, had been organizing for this for years and planning for it. At last we're independent. Nehru, who emerged as kind of the key figure in Indian politics for the next about 15 or 20 years. Nehru had been asked shortly before partition, did he think there would be any difficulties to worry about? And he said, no, no, no. No problems between the Muslims and the Hindus. It's all the British fault. As soon as they leave, no problems at all. Well, it's not that it was his fault. It's just, this is inevitably what happens. And yes, you can look at the British and say, oh, well, they played divide and rule for centuries. Well, all imperial powers, to some extent, do play a game of divide and rule. That is, they set one group up opposite the other. It's not that the British necessarily played favorites, though. In fact, to some extent, again, contrary to what you might think, the British tended to favor the Muslims to the extent they thought about it at all. This was actually carried over, interestingly, into the Cold War by the Americans. Like, if you follow the history of the Afghan War of the 1980s, it's a very similar story. The Americans were very keen on supporting the Mujahideen, in part because over the course of the Cold War, they developed a very strong preference for Pakistan over India. Yeah, in part because Nehru was kind of a fellow traveler in the sense that he wasn't actually a communist. But, he went to all of those communist fellow traveling events in Europe in the 20s and 30s. He embraced all the traditional left-wing causes. He enthused for the Republicans in Spain. He joined various committees in London. He was just a kind of right-thinking intellectual of the sort that even though his country was formally non-aligned, that it was not supposed to be a Soviet bloc country, it was very close to the Soviet Union, and remained so for most of the Cold War. In fact, this is one of the odd aspects of kind of Cold War espionage history. India was a prime battleground for like the spy wars on the ground. And the reason was because the Americans went there to study Soviet military equipment, because so much of it was, of course, sold to India. This was not the only country in which this happened. But anyways, so to get back to the British, like the Americans in the Cold War, the British in both Palestine and India had a certain, almost a temperamental preference for the Muslims. They admired them as a kind of warrior culture. Whereas the Hindus, of course, were sort of like these goofy vegetarian intellectuals. I'm caricaturing, of course, but that was sort of like the stereotype. The Muslims, well, you could sort of do business with them. The British understood their values, particularly British military officers, who tended to think of the Muslims. I suppose they thought of the Sikhs this way too, but I mean they thought of them again as a warrior culture, a warrior tradition. They didn't really think of the Hindus that way. And they definitely didn't think of the Jews that way. So to switch, again, from one of the big stories to the other, because we're not going to have time to do any of them justice, but we're going to have to look pretty closely at the Israel thing. It's such a huge part of 20th century history. The British definitely got the ball rolling. I mean, there's no doubt about this. With the Balfour Declaration issued on the 2nd of November 1917, the British, of course, pointed the way. They spoke of the eventual creation of possibly a home for the Jewish people, out of what would become the Palestinian Mandate, while also, of course, people hastened to add, saying that they would, respect and guarantee the rights of the Arab population of Palestine as well. Now, you may remember when we were looking at the First World War that there was a lot of contingent oddness about the Balfour Declaration in its timing. The British viewed Zionism as essentially a Germanic phenomenon, and they also were worried because of the Russian Revolution. They saw the Russian Revolution as both the work of the Germans, the Foreign Office, and also to some extent the Jews, who were very prominently represented in, of course, not only the Bolshevik Party, but many of the socialist parties of Russia as well. So Britain was thinking in these kind of geopolitical terms. It was almost like a parlor game. You've got this thing they thought of, it was Jewish opinion, which had always been pro-German. This was actually true. I mean, the early Zionists from Herzl on down, Theodor Herzl, who had, of course, famously petitioned Kaiser Wilhelm II and also Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Well, basically, after the Sultan turned him down, he went to the Kaiser, thinking, well, the Kaiser had influence on the Sultan. He was, of course, an Austrian Jew himself. The Zionist Committee, the International Zionist Executive, was actually located in Berlin. Most of the leading Zionists were Germans or Austrians. So Britain thought that Zionism was a German thing. And so they thought that by issuing this declaration to kind of endorse the aspirations of Zionists for a Jewish home in Palestine, they could basically take this weapon out of the hands of the Jews, out of the hands of the Germans, over to the Allied side in the war. was one of these kind of not terribly well thought out stratagems of the war. That in a curious way, it was actually occasioned, I mean literally, by a German newspaper editorial. They'd been thinking about it for a while, and then this German newspaper, published this editorial basically endorsing Zionism, at least indirectly. And the British thought then that the Germans were about to issue an official endorsement of Zionism. And so they rushed, again, the rush, to race the Germans and beat them to the path, which they did. They began having second thoughts almost immediately. Yes, they did organize a kind of legion under Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky. They didn't play much of a role, though, in the Palestine campaign. Lawrence's role, too, was exaggerated with his Arab irregulars. It was mostly a pretty proper military campaign under General Allenby. The Jewish Legion played almost no role at all. And then after the war, when the Palestinian Mandate was set up, the British decided fairly rapidly they weren't really all that fond of the Jews. I mean, it's an interesting thing, because to some extent I think the same preference it carries on today, like particularly among journalists. And it's partly this. The Jews of Israel, even today, I mean, they're famously sort of like fractious and, a little bit almost like uppity. They don't tend to dress very well. They dress very casually. Their manners are not, very elaborate. They're very brusque and direct and blunt. Whereas the Arab culture of the Levant, such as it existed then and to some extent endures now, is a little more languid. It's kind of like a tea house or coffee house culture where you spend a lot of time, sitting around. Elaborate manners. All of this the British, I think, responded to well. So even though they had sort of endorsed the Zionist cause in the Balfour Declaration, if you read it carefully, it's not necessarily a promise that they're going to create a Jewish state. It sort of envisions the possibility that they might eventually allow the Jews to have a national home in Palestine. Well, the British, they were to some extent committed to further migration of Jews, but again, they weren't terribly fond of the ones that they knew. So they began first subtly and then overtly taking the Arab side in various disputes. There were riots in Jerusalem in the early 1920s. They actually arrested Jabotinsky because he was trying to organize a sort of home defense legion to protect the Jews from, the kind of mobs that were, seeking them out. It was basically a matter of the Muslim mobs targeting Jews and just trying to kill them. The Jews smuggled in arms to try to create a kind of defense mob, and the British arrested them for basically weapons smuggling. It's true they later let Jabotinsky go. They also let the key Arab conspirator go. And this was, of course, the notorious, where did I write his name? I just wrote the Mufti up here, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Now, he was, they're anti-Semites and they're anti-Semites. Like, the British, as I said, they weren't fond of the Jews, but they weren't like raving anti-Semites. Hajj Amin al-Husseini was a raving anti-Semite. He was more anti-Semitic than Hitler. I kid you not. He actually met with Hitler. And he told Hitler to accelerate the Holocaust because it wasn't fast enough for him. That's how much he hated the Jews. He was a vicious anti-Semite. Now, which does not make him typical, does not make him normal. What made him particularly dangerous is that the British, for curious reasons that have still never been explained, appointed him Grand Mufti for life of Jerusalem in 1921. He was supposed to be even beyond Muslim affairs. He was supposed to be almost like the senior religious leader in Jerusalem. It was a terrible idea. This was a man who, again, he was a ferocious, raving anti-Semite. And what he actually started doing before he moved against the Jews, interestingly, he actually began killing Arab Muslims, who were moderate and not anti-Semitic enough. So that was kind of his strategy of radicalizing things. First, he went after the Arab moderates, and then eventually he began organizing pogroms against the Jews. Not just in Jerusalem, incidentally. He organized a major anti-Semitic pogrom in Baghdad in 1941. So things were starting to get uglier and uglier, in Jerusalem and the Palestinian Mandate. More Jews were arriving, yes, in part because of the Balfour Declaration. Between the First World War and, let's say, like the late 30s, the Jewish population went from about 100,000 up to about 400,000. So more Jews were arriving. Later on there was this argument that the Jews had quote-unquote stolen the land. That's literally untrue in the sense that for the most part they bought it. That's why they had all those Zionist committees in Europe. They raised money so they could buy land. But that said, neither side was really without fault in this. Obviously the Jews began to seem like they were dominating the local economy. Their manners and so on were kind of brusque and, kind of offensive. And once it became clear that the Mufti and his sort of like legions of anti-Semites were organized against him, the Jews, of course, began organizing their own sort of gangs. There was Irgun, which was, you might even say to some extent, was like the forerunner of some of the later terrorist organizations which would imitate it. It was also what was called the Stern Gang, led by, the first one was kind of Jabotinsky's creation, although it eventually emerged from his own shadow. And they began organizing their own, not really pogroms, they'd be more like staging incidents. At one point, Irgun actually blew up the King David Hotel because they were trying to kill the British. This, again, is not what we think today. By the late 1930s, it was pretty clear whose side Britain was on. They actually published a white paper in 1939, pretty much cutting off further migration of the Jews. It was called the White Paper. Some people have even said that this called the, you might say, sincerity or good faith of the Balfour Declaration into question. The British had literally turned against the idea. They were now actively opposing the further migration of Jews into Palestine. By that point, as I said, the population, the Jewish population, was maybe about 400,000. By the end of the war, it would be about 500,000, although that's really only, of course, because the British won the Battle of El Alamein. Had Rommel and the Germans pushed into the Middle East, the population probably would have been zero. But as it was between 400,000 and 500,000 by this point, but the British were actively trying to shut down the gates of further migration. I mean, literally, this episode I talked about where Irgun, blew up the King David Hotel was in 1946, so it was right after the war. And this episode just solidified what the British already thought, which was that the whole thing had been a mistake. So that it wasn't just that they were discouraging further migration. By 1946 and 47, right before the creation of the Mandate, the partition in Israel, the British Navy was literally running down Jewish refugee ships, which were trying to make it to Palestine. That is, these are Jews who are trying to escape the Holocaust from Europe. Most of them, get on boats in like Italy, Sicily and whatnot. They are trying desperately to make it to Palestine, where they think that Jews will finally have a place where they won't get killed by everybody. And the British have patrols keeping them from reaching the coast of Palestine. So that the immediate context of the UN partition plan, the immediate political context is, 1, the British do not want the Jews to have a national home. 2, the British want to wash their hands of the problem. So the first couple of things you have to understand then about the creation of this state. First of all is how accidental it actually was that Israel even got a state. It's true that it was the US under President Truman who pushed through the actual partition resolution. Where did I write this? Yeah, this is November 1947. Now, there's an interesting aspect about this. Truman was no more a great patron of British imperialism than FDR had been. The main difference between them, though, was this. Truman, as I said, did not tend to follow intellectual fashions. He was just kind of an ordinary, not real well-educated guy from the Midwest. I mean, he went to college, but he wasn't some elite Harvard man like FDR was. So he wasn't also prey to sort of intellectual fashions. He also was not as impressionable as FDR. Remember how I talked about how FDR had literally thought Stalin was like his buddy. He trusted Stalin. Here's an even more interesting quote. You may know that it's at about this time in the Second World War that the US developed its relationship with Saudi Arabia. Not because the US was running out of oil yet, but because the US was worried it was going to run out of oil. Britain had BP and essentially the Persian connection. The US still had its own oil, but was perennially worried about it running out. So anyway, they're beginning to set up this relationship with the Saudis. The war has created this ferocious demand for oil. FDR meets with Ibn Saud. He then goes to Congress, and he tells them, quote, "I learned more about the whole Zionist problem by talking with Ibn Saud for 5 minutes than I could have learned in exchange of 2 or 3 dozen letters." Yeah, I'll bet you learned a lot. I bet you learned a lot about the Jews from Ibn Saud and the Wahhabi Muslims of the Nejd. This, of course, being the country Saudi Arabia, which would greet the death of Adolf Eichmann in 1962, executed by the Israelis. Here died Adolf Eichmann, who had the honor of murdering 6 million Jews. FDR, in other words, was not friendly to the Jews. He was not friendly to Zionism. Had FDR lived another 3 years, Israel almost certainly would not have come into existence. So that's the first thing. There was a political angle too. FDR was much stronger politically than Truman. You know, he'd been president since 1933. He had an enormous coalition. He didn't need the Jews. He didn't need their votes. Truman did. His coalition was much thinner and more narrow. So, to some extent, yes, he listened to, you know, Jewish kind of political influence, lobbyists and so on in the United States. To some extent, yes. He did think it might be a way of winning their votes. I think it was also maybe a matter of conviction. You know, he saw the Jews as the great victims of the Second World War. He thought it was just the right thing to do. Okay, so that was important. Truman, after, again, the British sort of kicked the can in his direction. You know, we're washing our hands of the problem. Truman puts through a partition plan. Now, that partition plan, there's a lot of lying about it that goes on. It did give the Israelis, that is the Jews, their own state. It's not a very big state, however. It was, what was it? About, I've got the figure here. The number of square miles. 5,500 square miles. 5,500 square miles. How big is that? You know how big Turkey is? It's over 300,000. 60 times bigger. The Israelis got a tiny sliver of land along the Mediterranean coast, of which 60% was desert. Okay. What was the population of the territory that Israel was given? Do we know, like, roughly, was it mostly Jewish, partly Arab? It was mixed. Well, who had the majority? Wrong. The population was, I'll give you the figure, 538,000 Jews, 397,000 Arabs. Not an overwhelming majority. It was about like 5 to 4, a little bit more than 5 to 4. Yes, there was a thin Jewish majority. However, it was, of course, thought probably by a lot on the Arab side that this thin majority would not last. I mean, this has been the perennial assumption of the conflict, really going back a half of a century. If you look at demographics, you look at the birth rates, you think, well, you know, they're going to get overwhelmed and eventually there will be an Arab majority. Which is the reason Israel, of course, takes such very strict measures. You know, they give immediate citizenship to Jews from all over the world because they're desperate to preserve their majority. They did have a majority, though, just on this territory. Not in Palestine as a whole. No, in Palestine, the Palestinian Mandate, of course, they were a tiny minority. But over 90% of the land was given to the Arabs. Now, we've forgotten this now because we talk about the issue of Palestine. But the actual state which controlled the land was not, quote-unquote, Palestine. It was, of course, Jordan. Or as it was originally called, Transjordan. Now, Jordan, you know, then ruled by Hashemite king Abdullah, Jordan was the only country, you might say, with a direct territorial stake in this conflict. But interestingly, Abdullah, I mean, he wasn't like crazy mad imperialist. He just basically wanted the West Bank and Jerusalem, and including the old part of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be split into sections by the partition. And actually, he got that in the war. People have forgotten that. He actually did gain old Jerusalem, and he got pretty much everything he wanted. In fact, another thing people have forgotten is that when the PLO was founded, originally called Al-Fatah, you know, by Yasser Arafat, for the first 10 or 15 years, their terrorist activities were directed against Jordan, because Jordan actually controlled the land. Black September, you know, this group that was like in the early 1970s, they actually set off bombs in places like Amman, and the Jordanians, shall we say, repressed them with pretty impressive brutality. So anyway, so they just got a tiny sliver of the land. About 5,000 square miles with a slim but possibly fragile Jewish majority. They accepted the deal, right? The Arabs did not, and so you got a war. A war which, to the surprise of almost everyone, the Israelis won, because they were, of course, massively outnumbered. Sorry, was that?
6 days.
No, that was 1967. No, this war lasted longer than that. And it's true that the war produced a vast train of refugees, you know, as the Israelis won. There were over 500,000, you know, the so-called, the Palestinian refugees, as they were later called, put in these UN camps and so on. It's not always remembered that, of course, all of the Arab states expelled Jews following the war. They expelled over 600,000 in the first 10 years. So it's not a completely new story. I mean, you had similar population transfers elsewhere in the world in the 20th century. To some extent, I mean, you could even compare the problem to Cyprus or even like the Greek-Turkish population exchange. You know, it was ugly, but maybe it kind of made sense. You know, Israel became more of a Jewish state, whereas, of course, the rest of the part controlled by Jordan became more exclusively Arab with fewer Jews. The war, to a certain extent, didn't actually end in 1948, although Israel was recognized now as independent. The state of war between Israel and its neighbors, in fact, continued without interruption. Well, really, until Egypt signed the Camp David Accords in 1981. So the war, to a certain extent, continued. The Israelis won, but they always felt themselves to be, shall we say, in a difficult position because they were surrounded by hostile states. Interesting thing about that war. The Israelis fought with arms, presumably, from somewhere. Where did they get their arms? Anybody know? Another good guess, and completely and emphatically wrong. They got their arms from the Soviet bloc and from France. In both cases because Britain was the anti-Israel country and the Soviet Union and the French were trying to stick it to Britain. The French simply because they were sick of the British, and the Soviets because, again, this is a little bit more curious. It was actually the Czechs who sent the weapons, but of course it was the Russians who ordered them to do so. It was mostly Czech weapons with which the Israelis fought their own war of independence, along with French airplanes. The French continued supplying the Israeli Air Force right up into the 1967 war. In fact, this is another thing. Everyone has forgotten this today. But the whole first period, you might call it, of Israel's existence, up to the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel was a cause of the left, not the right. Today, as we know, like in America, it tends to be the right that kind of supports Israel. To the extent anyone supports Israel in Europe, which is not entirely clear, it tends to be people on the right as opposed to the left. Israel was originally a cause of the left, a very fervent and emphatic cause of the left. And this is partly because, as I think I've mentioned several times, socialism all along had been, of course, created by Jews and to some extent remained a phenomenon dominated by Jewish intellectuals. The Soviet Union in its early days was seen as a semi-Jewish kind of enterprise. It is true that immediately after the creation of the State of Israel, this changed very radically. Stalin went into a vicious anti-Semitic phase, and curiously enough, it was because the Israelis opened an embassy in Moscow and threw a great big party, and Stalin got pissed because he hated Jews and they were being loud. And so, I kid you not, this seems to have been what kicked off Stalin's last round of mania, where the last 5 years of his life, he sent another 500,000 people to the Gulag. He had this crazy, it was called the doctor's plot, where he began to think everyone was poisoning him. And he blamed it all on doctors, some of them Jews, and then he blamed it on other Jews, and he had Jews arrested and sent to the Gulag, and many of them simply shot. So curiously, it was all happening at a similar time. But right up to this time, the Soviet Union was still, to some extent, seen around the world as not necessarily a Jewish state, but as one that was supported by Jews where the Jews had done well, which they had. So this was true in the left in America and Europe as well. And Jews in America, and there were many of them, about 5 million of them by this point, nearly all of them were on the left politically. Most of them supported the Soviet Union, and so they associated Israel with that same cause. For the French, it was something of the same. I mean, it was a little bit like a little bit of idealism involved, a little bit of guilt involved because of France's own role in the Holocaust in Europe. But it was also because France, of course, was the world capital of intellectual socialist culture during the Cold War. Paris really became, the Sorbonne became the great hub of this. The 1967 war changed a lot. It changed a great deal. The main reason was because when Israel, of course, captured lands outside of the original mandate, the so-called occupied territories, Israel became, I guess you might say, it was seen now as something like a successful, almost imperialist power in its own right, such that it became more instinctively a cause of, people who believed essentially in legitimacy, people with a slightly more, shall we say, conservative orientation politically, and it lost its luster as a socialist cause, as a cause of the left. It was no longer innocent in the eyes of kind of Western socialists. Literally because it was now occupying what was called, according to international law, foreign territory. But so it's curious to remember all this. Israel was very much a cause of the left. It was supported by France. It was supported by the Soviet bloc. And paradoxically, it was also supported by the Americans, but not in a direct way. Not in terms of any arms shipments, nothing like that, just the symbolic support at the UN. This is important to remember because, again, our expectations based on what we think we know today would suggest that in the Suez Crisis of 1956, that Israel would, of course, have been supported by the Americans. Not true. The background of the Suez Crisis is interesting. I talked about the two, you might say, most important imperial flashpoints where the British withdrew. India, Palestine. Egypt was only nominally less important than that. Egypt was, in a certain sense, where the British Empire in Africa had gotten going, with the occupation in 1882 by Gladstone. Egypt had all along been a kind of strategic linchpin because of the Suez Canal, so it remained extremely important for the British. For that reason, they didn't just withdraw immediately. They withdrew their garrison from Alexandria as early as 1946, I believe. They began quietly withdrawing some of their forces in the late 40s, such that by about 1951, they had almost no troops left in the country. And this is when, there were riots going through Cairo, people targeting, Westerners, Western institutions. This is part of the chaos that eventually led to the army coup by which Nasser would come to power. And kind of become the leading archetype of this so-called pan-Arabism. Britain did not immediately withdraw. They did recognize the government as independent. So from 1952, at least according to international law, Egypt has been independent. They kept, kind of support personnel, technical service people at the Suez Canal so that they were still kind of looking over the thing. But by about 1954, 1955, Nasser was beginning to lose patience with even that limited presence. I think I did write up here. I know we're probably running towards the end of the first hour. I'll just mention it briefly. We'll come back to it again next week. This was the Bandung Conference held in Indonesia, hosted by President Sukarno in 1955. The idea was a kind of conference of the non-aligned, what would later be called the Third World. That is, the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa were getting together in a way to assert not just independence, but that they had a positive role to play in the world. A lot of it was, of course, kind of rhetorical humbug, but it kind of did catch on with a lot of these people. The idea that there was this new thing, the non-aligned movement. The French later coined the term Third World. It wasn't actually coined here, the tiers-monde, which the French called it. But the idea was, again, that these countries, they were not part of the capitalist West. They were not communist. They were new. They were free of the pathologies of the European world and its imperial sins and so on, that they would kind of cleanse the world of its sins and so on. Well, anyway, a lot of leaders go to this place like Nasser. They soak up the atmosphere, the kind of anti-Western rhetoric, and it has a big impact on them. It was the very next year when Nasser finally decided to make his first big move. The provocation was the famous Aswan Dam, on the Nile River. Big project, kind of typical of the age, a huge hydroelectric dam. Everyone was into, colossal scale and, modernization. It seemed to excite the imagination of a lot of people. He wanted U.S. funding. The U.S. finally turned him down, that is, for the loan. So, on the one hand, this is what you did in the Cold War. If you didn't get funding from one side, you'd go to the other. So he did begin to kind of embrace the Soviets, ask them for, of course, funds, loans, engineers. That's what you did. You joined one side or the other. Even if you claimed you were non-aligned, usually you had patronage from one side or the other. More to the point, he nationalized the Suez Canal. That is, he simply declared this is now, Egyptian property. The first of a major wave of these nationalizations, would get this with oil companies in places like, of course, Persia. You would get it famously in Libya, under Gaddafi. It was not necessarily something that was illegal in the strict sense of the word if compensation were provided. I mean, to some extent, all states had the right to do this. Nasser, of course, did it, though, in such a way as to kind of maximize the political effect of it such that the English were kind of, their amour propre, their pride was offended. It was Eden who was in power. Actually, Churchill had been briefly in power in the early 50s, but Labour was back in power under Anthony Eden. Now, again, a man who doesn't quite have Churchill's conviction. On the other hand, he did have a certain pride. So Eden did not want to just give up. Eden also didn't like Nasser. He thought he was kind of like this uncouth upstart, who was behaving offensively, with no good reason. That Britain should have been informed in advance. The whole thing was done badly. Well, anyway, so Eden, smarting, feeling a little bit almost insulted by this, tin pot rhetorician, he decides that Britain has to do something. What is Britain going to do? Well, here's the problem. Britain is supposed to be a great power. They think about it, they talk about it, well, we could invade the place, but wait a minute, we don't really have the troops. We can't really afford to do that. We don't really even have enough troop-carrying ships anymore. What can we do? Well, they realize they can't really do anything by themselves. They're no longer really a great power. I mean, this is like the point of fact. This is why they've been withdrawing from these places. They just can't afford the commitments anymore. So they talk to the French. Now, the French have their own motivations here. Some of it is to do with Israel. Some of it is to do with what's going on in northern Africa, where Algeria is kind of beginning to spiral out of control. The FLN in Algeria, the Front de Libération Nationale, which is set up by these kind of patriotic Arabs, most of them, of course, Muslim, who were, at first they just wanted independence, and then they got more and more anti-French when the French repression, measures got more and more brutal. The French were like bombing civilians from the air, not unlike, Gaddafi recently did. Then they got more brutal. And in 1955, they actually issued an order where like any French person, women, child, anyone could just be, executed just like that. Both sides were committing horrible brutalities, but things were getting really bad in Algeria. So France, again, it's kind of a pride thing. It's like, well, we've got to do something. We in Britain, we used to rule the world, and now everything is slipping out of our control. And so they come up with this plan. It's a little bit complicated. It does involve Israel. The plan goes something like this. Israel is still in a state of war with Egypt, remember. I mean, they never have a peace treaty. Egypt is still preventing Israel from sending anything through the Suez Canal. They're blockading Israel, in effect. Egypt has, in fact, just put together a kind of tripartite command with Syria and Jordan. This is in October 1956, planning for the future attack on Israel. So Israel sees that it has sufficient cause to attack. Britain and France say, okay, you do the attacking. And then once the kind of war begins and the crisis starts, Britain will send troops to occupy the canal, and what was France supposed to? I think France was supposed to take Port Said or something. But then basically the idea is like Israel attacks, creates a crisis, then France and Britain intervene. It's kind of a crazy plan. It's like desperate, right? They're desperate to just, show they still have they've still got the muscles. They can still do something. Of course, it turns out that they don't have the muscles. Why not? Who stops them? Good guess, but wrong. The Americans stopped them. Israel actually did attack, and Israel actually won. Everyone's forgotten that. Britain and France, however, were dissuaded from intervening when Eisenhower, who was the US president, who was up for re-election, basically he just got pissed. This is in like October of 1956. The presidential elections are scheduled for November. So Eisenhower is in the middle of an election campaign. And Anthony Eden dumps this thing in his face. And he says, oh God, I don't want to deal with this. And so he just basically threatens the Brits. He starts selling off the pound sterling. Like he instructs the US Treasury to short the British pound, which they do. And the British pound starts plummeting in the markets. And so Britain finally has to withdraw, and basically like with his tail between its legs, in utter humiliation. Then they're denounced in the United Nations, and the Americans go along with that. It's one of those odd, again, a little bit like Israel, an odd example in the Cold War where the US and the Soviets were sort of on the same side. The Soviets, too, wanted to see Britain and France humiliated by this point. Stalin, remember, he had already turned against Israel. So it's a really curious episode. But here's the thing. The Americans take the side of, the Arab, you might say, Muslim world, quote unquote, Nasser, right? And of course they get lots of thanks from the Arab world. It doesn't really seem to do anything for the Americans. I mean, it's one of the more interesting questions, I think, of 20th century history. Had the Americans taken the other side in Suez, that is, had they said, well, we like to think of ourselves as anti-imperialists, we don't really like the British and French and their imperial pretensions, but we're all still on the same side, basically, which is like the West in its interests, and so we're going to support them. Had the US done that, Nasser would have been humiliated, probably overthrown. The Suez Canal would have been taken back, by the West. Yeah, I don't really know what would have happened. Things would have looked very different in the Middle East. The Soviets probably would have intervened in some way. Maybe there would have been a more serious conflict. Things might have turned out very differently. Instead, the Americans, again, took the so-called Third World non-aligned side, and, well, Britain and France were humiliated. This basically is what killed off the British and French empires. Within about 7 years, there was nothing left of the British and French empires. They had no will left, they had no stomach. They had been humiliated and shown up by the Americans and even by Nasser. I probably run over time. We should take a short break here. And when we get back, we're going to look at some of the consequences of Suez. What time is it? 35? Okay, about 10 minutes.